Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into stacks of information and pull out the essential insights, the surprising nuggets, to help you get well-informed, fast.
Yep, we do the heavy lifting, you get the good stuff.
Exactly. And today we are diving into a really turbulent time for York, the early medieval period. We're talking from the Norman conquest onwards, basically. What actually happened after the Vikings, when William the Conqueror arrived?
How did it change the city? I mean, the physical city you might walk through today.
Yeah, it's a story of, well, destruction, submission, but then also massive rebuilding.
A complete transformation, really. It fundamentally changed York.
Before we get stuck into all that, though, a quick word. If you're visiting York, or even if you live here, and want the real inside track, you should definitely check out Alistair's book, York, Local Knowledge, Must-Do Top Tens, and the Vouchers to Get Them for Less.
It's brilliant. Packed with local secrets. You can find it on iBooks and Google Books.
And if you need somewhere amazing to stay, right in the city center, take a look at House of York Holiday Homes. That's www.houseofyork.org.
They've got beautiful places, even some next door to each other for bigger groups, and crucially, run by locals who really know their stuff. Makes all the difference.
Definitely. So, okay, let's dive in. Picture York, 1066. William the Conqueror's just won Hastings. He's looking north. What does he know about York?
Well, he'd certainly know it was important. A major city, Roman walls, still probably visible, fortified, and critically, the archbishop's seat, a huge power base in the north.
Right. So, undeniable status. But, not everyone writing about it back then was quite so complimentary, were they? Some descriptions are, well, pretty harsh.
Oh, absolutely. You get William of Malmesbury writing maybe 60 years after the conquest, describing the local language. He called it, get this, sharp, slitting, frothing, and unscapey.
Chuckles slightly unscaped. What does that even mean? Sharp and frothing sounds quite aggressive.
I think we can probably translate that as loud, harsh, and completely unintelligible to him. And then Richard Devizes, late 12th century. He just comes right out with it.
What do you say?
York, full of Scotsmen, filthy and treacherous creatures, hardly men.
Charming. So a bit of north-south prejudice going on there, perhaps.
Very likely. It tells you more about southern perceptions, maybe, than York itself, because the reality was this was an ancient city, a major trading hub, a powerful religious center. These descriptions kind of ignore all that.
Right. And a city that had been basically Viking for 2 centuries, lots of Danish connections, culture, leadership. They probably weren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat for a Norman king.
No, Orderic Vitalis, a chronicler, says York was seething with discontent when William first properly arrived with an army in 1068. They had their own history, their own ways. Norman rule wasn't welcome.
And William knew this. His response was pretty forceful, wasn't it? Building works were key.
Immediately.
Yeah.
His first big move in 1068, build a castle. Then barely a year later, 1069, he builds another one.
2 castles right next to each other. Why?
It really shows how seriously he took controlling York. Standard Norman design, initially Mart and Bailey. Basically a big earth mound with a wooden tower and a defended courtyard. Quick to put up, but a real statement of power.
And their location. Strategic.
Oh, yes. Controlling river access, seems likely. Positioned to dominate the city. Clifford's Tower, the stone one we see now, is built on the mound of one of those original castles.
So the stone tower came much later, building 2 wooden ones so fast, though.
It really highlights the resistance he expected and how vital York was for controlling the whole north. You didn't usually see 2 castles like that, except maybe London.
And that resistance he expected, it arrived.
It did, big time. Resentment boiled over. Locals teamed up with a large Danish fleet that sailed up the Humber and Ouse, plus some powerful Anglo-Saxon nobles who hadn't submitted.
So a full-scale rebellion.
Absolutely. They attacked the Norman garrisons in these new castles, and in a pretty desperate move, they actually set fire to parts of the city themselves.
To try and smoke the Normans out.
Presumably. But it backfired terribly. The fire spread, burned the wooden castles, and the Norman garrisons inside were massacred.
Wow. Setting fire to your own city, that's extreme. And William's reaction to that?
Utterly ruthless. He came back north in the autumn of 1069 and unleashed what's known as the harrying of the north. Or sometimes the harrowing.
Sounds grim.
It was. It was a military campaign, but designed to utterly devastate the Yorkshire countryside. Orderic Vitalis, again, his account describes just horrific cruelty. Burning homes, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, driving people out, basically creating famine and destitution.
How widespread was it?
The exact scale is, well, debated. Orderic might have exaggerated for effect. We don't know modern figures, obviously. But the Doomsday Book, the big survey done in 1086, It records huge numbers of villages across Yorkshire simply as waste.
Waste, meaning
Right.
empty, destroyed.
It could mean totally depopulated, abandoned. Or maybe just so devastated they couldn't produce anything, couldn't pay tax. Either way, it points to a massive destruction event across the region surrounding York, a deliberate policy of terror, really.
And did it work? Did it crush the rebellion?
Eventually, yes. By Christmas 1069, the resistance was broken, the remaining population submitted, but the cost was immense. York and the region were scarred.
So after all that destruction, how did the Normans start to remake the city? Rebuilding must have been a priority.
Definitely, both practically and symbolically. And the first major project was the Minster.
Right, the cathedral. What happened to the old Anglo-Scandinavian one? Was it damaged in the fires?
It seems it was dismantled, yeah, probably damaged, but also perhaps seen as part of the old order. The new Norman Archbishop, Thomas of Bayeux, appointed by William, started building a brand new Grand Norman Minster.
On a Norman scale,
Yeah.
presumably.
Oh, yes. Excavations show its foundations, and its plan looks like it was based on the church back in Bayeux in Normandy. It was a huge project, and actually, understanding its original layout baffled historians for ages until archaeology helped sort it out.
So, importing Norman architecture. Any other massive projects?
Yes, a couple of really significant ones. In 1089, St. Mary's Abbey was refounded. Benedictine monks. It became incredibly wealthy and powerful, the most important abbey in the north.
Okay, and you mentioned something about a fish pool. Sounds a bit less grand.
Well, its purpose was pretty grand. The Foss fish pool. They dammed the River Foss, creating this huge artificial lake right next to Clifford's Tower.
For defense.
Primarily, yes. It made that side of the castle mound basically impregnable, a massive water barrier. But, practical Normans. It also provided a massive supply of fish for the city, defense and dinner.
Chuckles clever. So these big projects, the two castles, the huge new minster, St. Mary's Abbey, this massive fish pool, they literally reshaped the map of York.
Completely altered the landscape, changed river courses, created new enclosed areas like the Abbey Precinct, visually stamped Norman power and religion onto the city. You can still see the legacy of that reshaping today.
Let's think about the people. Who are these Normans moving in? Was it just soldiers?
No, not just soldiers. It was a diverse group, many from Normandy itself, obviously, but others came from places like Flanders, the Low Countries, and they were settling alongside the existing Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Scandinavian population. Over time, things mixed, people assimilated.
Doomsday Book calls them Frenchmen.
Yes, that's the term used. And you see patterns, like settlements perhaps clustering in the northeast of the city. Interestingly, later in this period, you get a really strong anti-Scottish feeling recorded.
Why was that?
Probably York's position. It was quite near the frontier of Norman control, relatively close to Scotland, so tensions, border raids, that sort of thing likely fueled it.
And how was the city actually run? Did the old ways disappear overnight?
Not entirely, it seems. Before the conquest, we hear about 12 lagamen, or lawmen, possibly important figures in city governance. Information's a bit patchy. After 1066, though, things become clearer. The sheriff becomes hugely powerful.
The king's representative.
Exactly. Figures like Damley, Osborne early on, they were responsible for justice, collecting taxes, keeping the peace, defense, massive authority. And certain families associated with them, like the Selbys, Lefwins, Tickhills, became really dominant locally.
What about those 12 lawmen?
They're still mentioned in the Doomsday Book, so they seem to have continued in some capacity, maybe alongside the sheriff initially, a sort of overlap. But as time went on, the city actually started gaining more independence from the sheriff and the crown. They got their own charters, more rights,
Leading to?
leading to the first recorded mayor of York, a man named Hugh Selby, in 1217. A big step towards self-governance.
Okay, so you have the sheriff, old lawmen, powerful new families, the archbishop, the abbot of St. Mary's. Sounds like a lot of cooks in the kitchen. Were there conflicts?
Oh, absolutely. Constant friction. One really long-running saga was the primacy dispute.
Between who?
The archbishops of York and Canterbury. Basically, a centuries-long argument about which archbishop was the top dog in England. Apparently, whenever they had to meet, things could get quite physical, or at least very undignified, according to some accounts.
Seriously, bishops brawling.
Or their entourages, anyway. Lots of jostling for position. And then within York itself, big disputes between the ordinary citizens, the dean and chapter running Minster, and the abbot and monks of St. Mary's, arguing over land, legal rights, who controlled what patch. It was a lively political scene, let's say.
Okay, let's shift to daily life. What did people actually do? Trade seems key.
Hugely important. By the early 1200s, York was ranked the seventh most important port in England. That's massive.
Yeah.
So industries connected to that thrived. Shipbuilding, obviously.
Other crafts.
Yes, this is when we really see craft guilds starting to formalize. Groups of artisans organizing. The weavers are the first ones recorded paying a fee to the king, showing you were organized and recognized. But you had glovers, saddlers, butchers, many others forming guilds too.
And markets were central.
Absolutely vital. Places like the Shambles, which we still know today, Pavement, Thursday Market specifically for meat, and big annual fairs like St. Peter's Fair and Lammas Fair, attracting traders from all over.
What kind of goods?
Exports were dominated by wool, shipped off to Flanders mainly. Imports included things like wine from France. York was connected. Traders came from Flanders, France, even Italy. And, well, where there's official trade.
There's smuggling.
The sources certainly mention it, people trying to avoid the taxes, no doubt.
So a busy commercial city. What about other aspects of life? You mentioned chroniclers writing about angels and devils earlier.
Yes, it really highlights a different worldview. Religion wasn't just a Sunday thing, it was woven into the fabric of everyday life. People genuinely believed in encounters with demons, angels. Prayer, both public and private, was seen as a real, necessary defense against evil forces. It permeated everything.
And practical safety. Fire must have been a nightmare in a largely wooden city.
A constant threat. We know there was a huge fire in 1137 that caused massive devastation. Whether it was one single event or just the worst of many is debated, but it shows how vulnerable the city was.
And hygiene? Probably best not to ask.
Well, archaeological digs show what you'd expect, layers of rubbish, organic waste building up. Sanitation wasn't great, let's be honest. But there are hints later on of some civic efforts to manage waste, perhaps trying to keep main streets cleaner. Baby steps.
Was there any kind of social safety net? Care for the sick or poor?
Yes, there were important institutions. St. Leonard's Hospital, near the Minster, was a major one. It cared for the sick, the elderly. And St. Nicholas Hospital outside Walmgate Bar was specifically for people with leprosy, a much-feared disease back then. So organized charity existed.
And wealth. Was it spread evenly?
Definitely not huge gulfs. You had incredibly wealthy churchmen and Norman lords, powerful merchant families, and then you had ordinary craftspeople, laborers, the poor. Sources hinted everything from dire poverty to what's been called wealthy squalor, people with money but still living in pretty basic conditions by our standards.
Any glimpses of art or culture surviving from this time?
Yes, despite all the turmoil, there were real achievements, especially in sculpture and stained glass for the new Norman churches. Inside the Minster today, you can still see some amazing 12th century pillars. There are also important stone carvings that survived, like the Doom Stone and a beautiful Madonna and child sculpture.
And other churches?
Some fantastic Romanesque doorways survive on parish churches. St. Margaret's and St. Denis's in Walmgate, St. Nicholas's on Lawrence Street, Holy Trinity over in Micklegate. They really give you a feel for the Norman architectural style. And incredibly, digs near Stonegate actually found the remains of a Norman stone house, a rare glimpse of domestic building from the time.
Amazing that these traces are still there, but you said it wasn't all just rebuilding and trade. There were other violent episodes after the conquest.
Absolutely. It remained a turbulent place. York citizens got involved in smuggling weapons during the young king's revolt against his father Henry II in the 1170s. Shows ongoing discontent, perhaps.
But the most infamous event is surely the massacre of the Jewish community in 1190.
A truly horrific episode. It happened against a backdrop of rising anti-Jewish feeling across Europe, often linked to crusading fervor. But locally, it seems it was really fueled by resentment over debts owed to Jewish moneylenders.
Because Christians weren't supposed to lend money at interest?
Exactly. So the Jewish community filled a vital economic role, but it made them vulnerable and targets for resentment. Things escalated dramatically in York in 1190. Violence broke out, and the Jewish community fled for safety to the royal castle, the Wooden Tower on Clifford's Mound.
And they were besieged there.
Yes, by a mob, apparently led by indebted local nobles and others, including a figure named Richard Maelbus, which literally means evil beast. Grimly fitting.
What happened?
The accounts are horrifying. Facing the mob, many of those trapped inside chose to kill themselves and burn their belongings rather than be captured, baptized by force, or murdered. Those who did surrender or were captured when the tower was stormed were massacred.
And the authorities, did they try to stop it?
Their role is disturbingly unclear. The sheriff seems to have done little to intervene effectively, whether it was inability, indifference, or even complicity because some officials were also in debt. It's debated. But the result was a catastrophic failure to protect the community, a terrible stain on the city's history.
So early medieval York wasn't just about settling down under Norman rule at all.
Far from it. You had the chaos of the Civil War under King Stephen the Anarchy, which definitely impacted the North. You had ongoing threats like Scottish raids getting worryingly close in 1138. And all those internal power struggles we mentioned between citizens, church, abbey, it was a dynamic, often dangerous, and constantly evolving place.
Okay, so pulling all this together, the Norman conquest, the harrying, the rebuilding, the castles, Minster, Abbey, the trade, the guilds, the politics, the violence, the tragedy. What's the big picture? What does this period really tell us about York?
I think the key thing is just how completely the Norman conquest reshaped the city. It wasn't just a change of management. It was a physical, political, and social transformation imposed after brutal conflict. The Normans literally rebuilt York in their image, around their power structures, the castles, the minster, the abbey.
But despite that brutal beginning, the city didn't just become a Norman clone. It rebuilt, trade boomed, it carved out some independence.
Exactly. There's a resilience there, an adaptability. It absorbed the shock, rebuilt, and continued as a major center. But those conflicts, the archbishop arguments, the city versus the church fights, the horror of 1190, they showed the deep tensions running beneath that Norman order.
And so much of that physical and institutional framework laid down, then the castle site, the minster's dominance, the street patterns influenced by abbey walls or defenses, the legacy of being a major northern hub, it's still visible today.
Absolutely. It formed the foundations of the medieval city that followed, and you can still feel the echoes, which maybe leads to a final thought.
Going.
When you think about everything York went through in this period, the sheer destruction, the constant need to rebuild, to defend itself, to navigate these intense internal power struggles, how much of that sort of tough, perhaps slightly independent or resilient character forged in that early medieval fire might still be part of the city's identity today? Something to ponder as you walk those streets.
That is a great question to mull over. Before you do, though, one last reminder. For unlocking York's secrets, grab Alistair's book, York Local Knowledge Must Do, Top 10s and the Vouchers to get them for less. It's on iBooks and Google Books.
And if you need that perfect place to stay, really central and run by people who love the city, visit www.houseofyork.org. House of York Holiday Homes. They'll look after you.
Join us next time for another deep dive.